Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this part 2 video, we're going to be taking a look at the remaining Halloween films that I didn't cover in part 1, that being the 2 Rob Zombie remakes as well as the Blumhouse David Gordon Green directed new trilogy of films. If you want to see me discuss my thoughts on Halloweens 1 through 6 or H2O and Resurrections, I strongly recommend checking out part 1, to which I'll leave a link in the description down below. With that out of the way, let's get started with the Rob Zombie's 2007 remake of Halloween. So this is a bit of a weird one for me. I'd also like to preface this by saying I think that Rob Zombie seems like a really cool dude. All the interviews I've seen of him make me feel like he's probably a really nice person who's very passionate about the horror genre. That being said, I cannot stand his interpretation of Halloween or Michael Myers. Now, I completely understand why some people enjoy this movie. If you've always wanted to see a more brutal and angry version of Michael Myers, I can see why you'd like this film. In that same vein, if you're someone who's always wanted to learn more about Michael Myers' backstory, I can also understand your enjoyment of this film. However, I never wanted either of those things. For me, the best version of Michael Myers is the silent killer, the shape who waits in the shadows and strikes when you're least suspecting it. The pure incarnation of evil who has no rhyme or reason, just the embodiment of evil. When you see Michael at the beginning of the original Halloween film, all you see is a seemingly innocent 6-year-old child with normal suburban parents. However, Rob Zombie decides that isn't really his style and instead gives Michael a really in-depth backstory where he's not just a kid who snapped, but a kid who had literally every reason to become a killer. In this version, Michael has a hillbilly redneck abusive stepfather, a sister who bullies him constantly, and to add a cherry on top, his mother, played by Sherry Moon Zombie, Rob Zombie's wife, is a stripper, which leads to Michael getting bullied at school. And who do they choose to be his bully? That's right, the kid from Spy Kids.
You're a worthless little skort.
Now, I understand a lot of horror fans appreciate the film exploring Michael's backstory, but to me it takes away everything that's scary about Michael Myers. Any sane person who saw Michael's home life would expect him to snap and become a serial killer. What worked so well in the original is you never really get to know or sympathize with Michael. You see his face twice in the original, and only for a few seconds, once as a child, and the other after his mask is taken off in the climax. He never speaks, you know nothing about him. This film spends so long trying to explain his backstory and give you this extended look at the person behind the mask, and I don't know, to me it just removes the mystique and creepiness surrounding the character. Not only does it ruin what works about the character, at least in my opinion, but it also severely ruins the pacing of the film. Carpenter's original Halloween is a tightly crafted, neatly compact, extremely efficient 90 minutes, but since we didn't even meet Laurie Strode in the remake until about 30 to 40 minutes into the film, the climax feels too rushed with little to no build-up, and the first act feels like it drags on forever. Some of the kills in this film are pretty brutal, but whereas the original version of Michael seemingly killed in a quick, efficient fashion, this new 7-foot-tall Undertaker version of the character seems to take extreme amounts of joy in his brutal murders. And while the original Michael is silent the entire time other than heavy breathing, you can audibly hear this new Michael groaning and grunting, which just doesn't feel right to me. Still though, if you enjoy good kills in a slasher, this film definitely contains that, and I can sort of appreciate Zombie for trying to do his own thing. I just wish so many elements of the original weren't still in this film. It feels like it's fighting to be a Rob Zombie movie and fighting to be a Halloween film, and the two just don't coincide. I also can't stand the way that Rob Zombie writes his characters, and not just in this film. In all his films, every character is really obnoxious or just straight up doesn't talk how normal people talk. All in all, the film isn't the worst thing I've ever seen, and it's definitely not the worst Halloween sequel or remake, and it's at least more exciting than some of the more dull Halloween sequels. But it's just not for me. I'm not a fan of the pacing, the characters, the dialogue, or how the film decides to portray Michael Myers or Laurie Strode. And when one of the first lines of dialogue in your film is this,
"Maybe I'll choke the chicken, purge my snorkel all over them flappy ass tits,"
then you've already lost me. If you find the original Halloween boring or uneventful, maybe this one will be more up your alley, as it is more gruesome and a lot more brutal in terms of how it displays its violence. So this is one of the few instances where I will admit me being wrong. I used to actually like this film more than Rob Zombie's first remake. Now before you start chasing me with torches and pitchforks, let me explain myself. I never actually liked or enjoyed the film, but felt that at the very least they were really doing their own thing with this sequel. It was a heavy departure from the original Halloween 2 from 1981, and it felt like Zombie was really doing his own thing this time, as opposed to just remixing elements from the original film like he did with his first movie. That being said, I was a complete and utter idiot, and this film is a pile of shit. For starters, Laurie is absolutely insufferable in this film. I wasn't a huge fan of her in the first remake, but my god, they make her so much more obnoxious in the sequel. One of the elements I surprisingly liked was that they keep Annie alive for the sequel as opposed to the original where she is killed off in the first film. I like that they kept her face scarred up too from the events of the previous film, as it makes it feel like the first film has a little bit more weight to it. But if you think what they did to Laurie was bad, what they do to Sam Loomis should be considered a crime. I didn't mention it when discussing the first film, but in the remake, Dr. Sam Loomis is now played by a Clockwork Orange star, Malcolm McDowell, and in the first film, he's actually pretty damn good. He turns in a solid performance, and despite my frustration with the extended backstory, one of the elements that I did like was them building upon the relationship between Michael and Loomis. Whereas Donald Pleasance in the film has to establish the relationship between him and Michael solely through dialogue, Malcolm McDowell actually has scenes with a young Michael, which adds a lot to the connection between the two. However, after nearly being killed by Michael in the first film, this version of Dr. Loomis turns into a complete self-absorbed asshole, preying and profiting on the tragedies that happened in the previous film and spending most of this movie yelling at people, including his assistant, who simply questions the morality of what he's doing. They make him such an insufferable jack-off in this film that you honestly root for him to get axed off. And of course, since it's a Rob Zombie horror film, you get your obligatory white trash characters that are just there to get murdered. Michael, meanwhile, spends most of this film as a homeless bum wandering around with a knapsack with a thick-ass beard and eating dogs. Like, why do I need to see Michael Myers feasting on a canine? That's not what I need in my Halloween movies. And since again, it's a Rob Zombie film, his wife Sherry, of course, has to be involved, despite her character dying in the previous movie. She actually has more screen time in this one, which, of course she does. This time she's a ghost or vision that Michael sees, telling him he must hunt down Laurie so their family can finally be together. There's also this white horse that keeps randomly popping up along with Michael's mother. Why? I don't know. Symbolism, I guess? Regardless, this film is boring, forgettable, and despite Zombie's attempt at doing his own thing, this film and its predecessor showcase that Zombie would have been more suited for a Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Friday the 13th reboot, as he turns Michael Myers from a silent stalker of the night into a discount Jason Voorhees. Oh yeah, and if all that other stuff wasn't bad enough, Michael fully speaks in this film. Not just grunts or groans, actually speaks.
For God in heaven, die!
I never want to watch this movie again. So this might be the one that pisses the people off the most. I do not like this movie. Released back in 2018 and helmed by the director of Pineapple Express, David Gordon Green, the film brings Jamie Lee Curtis back as Laurie Strode. In this new timeline, Laurie never had a daughter named Jamie Lloyd, never had a son named John, but instead had a different daughter named Karen, this time played by Judy Greer. In this timeline, Laurie Strode never leaves Haddonfield and instead is traumatized by the events of the original film 40 years later. She essentially turns into a less functional version of Sarah Connor from Terminator 2. She also has a granddaughter named Allison in this film who serves as essentially the protagonist of this new trilogy. This timeline also completely ignores every other Halloween film in the franchise except for the original, acting as a direct sequel to Halloween 1978, in which Michael was captured immediately after killing 3 teenagers and attempting to murder Laurie. Since then, he's been kept in an insane asylum for 40 years, in which time Laurie seemingly couldn't move past her trauma and believed Michael would always escape, leading her to train her daughter Karen how to fight and use weapons until Child Protection Services took Karen away when she was 12 years old. This has caused quite a rift in the Strode family, as it's caused Karen to resent her mother and put emotional distance between Laurie and her granddaughter Allison. This is sort of similar to the first Rob Zombie film, where I completely understand why people like this movie. It's definitely one of the better sequels, especially in terms of competence in the directing and visuals. There's a nice tone and atmosphere in this film, as well as some really great shots and framing choices. One long shot in particular is exactly the type of cinematography that I want to see in Halloween films, and makes me sad we didn't see more of it in this new trilogy. The music is also pretty stellar, as Carpenter's original theme is not only reincorporated, but also some nice new tracks are added into the film that spruce up the soundtrack. Also, I like seeing 3 generations of Strodes deal with the horror and darkness of Michael Myers. However, like I said, I do not like this movie, and that's because the script is god-awful. For starters, the film begins with 2 true crime podcasters speaking to Michael after being silent for 40 years. They try and provoke him by holding up his mask, and remember, this is a direct sequel to the original, and in the original film, Michael just breaks into a Halloween store and steals a random mask. But this film acts as if the mask has any special meaning to Michael, which again, it shouldn't. It's a random mask he stole 40 years ago, yet they try and provoke Michael with it as if all the other sequels still exist, which the film is adamant about telling you they do not. They even have dialogue from Allison that clarifies Michael and Laurie are not brother and sister in this timeline, and that it was just a rumor. So then, A, why does Laurie feel like Michael is going to come after her despite being held in captivity for 40 years? And B, why does Michael even go after Laurie to begin with once he does escape? If the events of the sequels never happened, then Laurie isn't his baby sister, but just some random teenager whose friends he's murdered back in the late 70s. I also have a problem with how they depict Laurie. Listen, I'm not trying to downplay trauma or grief, but the one character makes a solid point. By today's standards, the events of the original Halloween film aren't that crazy. I mean, if it were real life, it would of course be super sad to have 3 of your friends killed by an escaped mental patient. But for it to traumatize you to the point where even 40 years later, despite this madman being held in captivity, that you can't even live a functioning life or go to a simple dinner with your family without inhaling a glass of wine and breaking into tears, it just doesn't really feel plausible. And to add on to that, if you're so traumatized by this one night years ago, why the absolute fuck do you still live in Haddonfield? Why don't you move to literally anywhere else in the world, or at the very least the next state over? And therein lies the biggest issue with this film. It only takes half a second of really thinking about the plot, and the entire movie starts to collapse on itself. They also do this really lazy thing where in the film, Allison and her boyfriend get into a fight and he throws her phone into pudding so that nobody can get in touch with her. I get it's a horror film, a slasher no less, so stuff like this is bound to happen, but isn't there a better way to handle that silly plot point? I will say, the climax of this film is pretty damn good and provides a compelling and exciting showdown between the 3 Strode women and Michael Myers. But again, the stupidity of the script makes even some of these scenes fall apart. The whole scene of Karen pretending to be scared to lure Michael to the basement so that she can shoot him makes no sense because it's already been established she's had extensive training and has been prepared for this. So she's really not fooling the audience, only Michael, but the way the scene is directed and edited makes you feel as if they're really trying to trick you as an audience member as well. If you enjoyed this film, I don't blame you. After the influx of terrible sequels and remakes, this is definitely a refreshing film that delivers on some of what works about the original film, but it starts to fall apart the second you think about it. There's some really great kills and solid gore that will satisfy that slasher itch, but it just doesn't really work as a film despite having a fairly entertaining climax and a really great final shot. We are back to the cartoon movies, and I am so happy to be back. While Halloween 2018 is, in my opinion, a flawed but ambitious return to the Halloween formula, Halloween Kills is quite possibly the best comedy of 2021. A little not safe for work content coming up for those under 18, but when this film came out and I was still living in California, I took a couple edibles before walking to the theater, and to this day, it's one of my favorite theater experiences of all time. I've also developed quite possibly the easiest drinking game of all time when it comes to this movie, just drink anytime any character says, "Evil dies tonight." You may die of blood alcohol poisoning, but it'll sure as hell make the movie a better time. I'm still kind of baffled as to how this movie became a reality, as all of the decisions are so perplexing. If you haven't seen the film and are still watching, the film picks up immediately after the ending of Halloween 2018, very similar to how Halloween 2 back from 1981 picks up right after the events of the original 78 film, but this time not before a flashback back to 1978, right after Michael is shot out of the window by Dr. Sam Loomis. A young Frank Hawkins, a police chief introduced in the previous film, is surveying the streets of Haddonfield looking out for the masked killer that is Michael Myers. Events unfold in which Frank accidentally shoots and kills a fellow police officer and in turn becomes the one who stops Sam Loomis from killing Michael for good, which is information we did learn about in the 2018 film, but seeing it actually unfold was pretty damn stupid. Don't worry though, the stupidity continues as we cut back to present day as the Strode ladies are riding off in the back of a pickup truck as Michael is supposedly burning alive. However, when the firemen arrive, we get a pretty brutal massacre scene where Michael kills several firemen in pretty horrific fashion, and the rampage continues. Now, one of the dumbest and most hilarious bits of this movie is that the film tries to implement a message and themes of mob mentality, as later on in the film, news reports of the events that unfolded in the first film make waves throughout the town. We see this at a local bar hosting a talent show in which we meet 3 legacy characters from the franchise, including a grown-up version of Tommy Doyle, not played by Paul Rudd, but this time played by Breakfast Club alum Anthony Michael Hall, the nurse who was attacked in the beginning of the 1978 original, and Lindsay Wallace, who was the little girl being babysat by Annie Brackett in the original film. Really trying to prey on that nostalgia, aren't you, Blumhouse? Either way, once news breaks of Michael's return, Tommy Doyle ends up leading an angry mob of Haddonfield residents in which we begin the trend of every character and their mother yelling out, "Evil dies tonight." The most hilarious and downright ridiculous scene in this movie revolves around the angry mob chasing down whom they presume to be Michael Myers. And keep in mind, they show a picture of Michael's face on the TV, so everyone theoretically should know what he looks like. However, the guy the angry mob believes to be Michael is actually a 5'2" chubby balding man that looks like a discount Danny DeVito, which just saying that out loud has me holding in a burst of laughter. Even funnier is after this guy jumps to his death to avoid being mauled by an angry mob, they sort of just gloss over it. Tommy Doyle apologizes, and seemingly all is forgiven. And if you were wondering if Jamie Lee Curtis compared this film to the Black Lives Matter movement, you are absolutely correct.
Halloween Kills movie is about a mob. What happens when trauma infects an entire community, and we're seeing it everywhere with the Black Lives Matter movement.
Also, remember, the gotcha moment from the first film? Well, if you liked that, folks, they do it again, just somehow even dumber. The film ends with Karen leading Michael into another trap, this time instead of a seemingly inescapable fiery death trap, it's local residents of Haddonfield who attempt to jump Michael Myers. Now keep in mind, some of them do have guns. They just decide to get within close enough distance for Michael to grab the guns and absolutely massacre every single person in the mob, which is a fitting way for these fucking idiots to die. The film ends with Karen looking outside Michael's childhood bedroom window when, of course, Michael appears behind her and kills her, which feels like a really strange way to end not only the film but to kill off one of the primary characters in this new franchise. Halloween Kills is right, killing my will to live. Oh yeah, and if you wanted more Jamie Lee as Laurie, you're shit out of luck as she spends the entire film laid up in a hospital bed flirting with Frank Hawkins. Yep, that's right, the cop who took a knife to the jugular in the last film is still alive, because why the fuck not? This is a cartoon movie made by clown people, and if you try to tell me that this film is anything other than one of the most hilarious comedies of the last 15 years, then I challenge you to explain how every single scene in this film isn't funny. Jokes aside, I do enjoy this film as it is very entertaining, but not for the reasons I think the filmmakers wanted us to be entertained by. For me, it's up there with Halloween Resurrections as one of the funniest entries in the Halloween franchise. We've done it, folks. The final Halloween film. Well, for now, as I'm 100% certain that we will get more in the future. But the final film in the David Gordon Green trilogy graced us in 2022, a year after Halloween Kills, this time appearing in theaters and directly on Peacock, which is where I watched it. again on some edibles. This might be the most confusing horror film I have ever seen in my entire life. I genuinely mean that with no sense of sarcasm, as I have never been more confused at the end of a horror movie than after finishing Halloween Ends. For those of you still watching, if you haven't seen the film, this is like the equivalent of if in Star Wars Return of the Jedi, you didn't see Darth Vader for 90% of the movie, and Luke Skywalker isn't really the main character anymore. He shows up a little bit, but isn't the lead. Instead, some guy named, I don't know, Cliff is the lead, and most of the movie follows Cliff until the last 15 minutes where Cliff dies. Vader shows up and then has a showdown with Luke. That's essentially what Halloween Ends does, as Laurie Strode isn't the main character anymore. Michael Myers is barely in the film, and even Laurie's granddaughter Allison is no longer the lead. Instead, the main character is some guy named Cory. If you're wondering if I forgot to mention Cory in the last two films, no, I didn't. This is the first movie we're introduced to him. And to remind you, this film was marketed as the final showdown between Laurie Strode and Michael Myers, which the film does have, granted, but again, not until the last 10 minutes. Instead, the film follows Cory as a year after the events of Halloween Kills, we see Cory babysitting a young child. The child then pulls a prank on Cory, and due to an unfortunate and horrible accident, the child ends up falling and brutally dying as their parents are just arriving home, to which Cory is absolved of any murder charges but is viewed by most of the town as a kid killer. Which, honestly, if this wasn't a Halloween film, sounds like a really interesting plot. But this is a Halloween film, ultimately, and as a Halloween movie, it fails miserably. Michael doesn't even show up until like 40 minutes into the movie. Essentially, the plot revolves around Cory being bullied by the town and ends up developing a relationship with Allison after Laurie introduces the two of them. After being thrown off a small bridge, Cory is dragged into a sewer by Michael but isn't killed. Instead, Michael, I guess, sees the inherent evil in Cory and decides to let him live. Cory then heads down the path of evil and starts assisting Michael in killing, going as far as to lure Allison's cop ex-boyfriend to Michael so the two can tag team kill him like you're watching WWE. Oh, if you didn't think seeing Michael team up with an absolute dweeb was bad enough, at a later point in the film, Cory wrestles Michael to the ground like a goddamn child and steals his mask. Yeah, you thought Busta Rhymes karate kicking Michael out of a window was bad? We didn't know how spoiled we were. The worst part is that towards the climax of the film, Cory just ends up killing himself, and then Michael shows up for the advertised final showdown with Laurie. And if you thought the movie was done being ridiculous, sorry to disappoint, as after Michael and Laurie face off, Laurie is able to pin Michael down with a fridge, taking the opportunity to slit his wrist and throat. After defeated, Laurie and the residents of Haddonfield parade his body through the streets strapped to the hood of their car and put him in a grinder, crushing his body. All of this occurring as Laurie does voiceover about how the memory of Michael Myers will fade into obscurity, as she writes about it in a book that she plans on selling. This is such a fucking strange film, because 90% of it feels more like a remake of John Carpenter's other film, Christine, and then maybe 10% of it feels like the climactic finale that the trailers made it out to be. Honestly, it's a shame, because Cory's story isn't even bad. It's not horribly shot or written, well, except for the cringy band geeks that are the bullies of Cory. However, in a Halloween film, his story and character feel so out of place. Most of this movie just isn't really a Halloween film. And had they maybe introduced Cory in one of the previous two entries, maybe this could have been a really unique and interesting entry in the franchise. But instead, we get a clusterfuck finale that feels like the franchise is going out with a whimper of a fart instead of a solid bang. And my god, there's just so many cringe-inducing scenes in this movie. The whole relationship between Allison and Cory is so rushed and off-putting. I didn't even address what they did to Laurie in this film. So remember in Halloween 2018 how I mentioned that it really doesn't make too much sense for Laurie to be so traumatized 40 years after the events of the original, despite knowing Michael is locked away and having no connection to him. Well, in this film, Laurie, despite Michael being on the loose and presumably anywhere, despite him returning and killing not only dozens of Haddonfield residents, but her own daughter and her daughter's husband, has now transformed from Sarah Connor into Martha fucking Stewart. So, just to be clear, after killing 3 people 40 years ago and being held in captivity, Laurie is so traumatized she cannot even function. But after escaping, killing dozens of people, killing her daughter, and being on the loose, now Laurie is a fully functioning adult who bakes pies for fun. What the actual fuck? This one is easily the most perplexing Halloween film, as again, most of it really isn't one. They market it as the final showdown between the most iconic slasher and most iconic final girl of all time, just to deliver us a film that doesn't focus on that for 90% of the runtime. Even the film itself, removed from Michael Myers, is just a good concept and average to below average execution at best. The plot makes little to no sense, and the concept of introducing a brand new protagonist into the franchise in the quote-unquote last film is one of the most mind-boggling creative decisions ever made in any film series ever. Honestly, watch this one if you want to just be shocked at how this ever got greenlit by a studio. Well, folks, we did it. We finally got through all 13 Halloween films. This one took a lot out of me, I won't lie. I did indeed rewatch every Halloween film in preparation for this video, so I hope my sacrifice was worth it, as some of these were really rough to sit through. That being said, I really hope you guys enjoyed these videos as much as I enjoyed making them. Maybe I'll make it a yearly tradition where I tackle a different iconic horror franchise. It was a lot of fun, even if it was taxing to revisit some of the sequels that I haven't seen in many years. Make sure, if you liked the video, to click the like button, subscribe if you want to hear more from me, and click the little bell notification button so you get notified when I post new videos. Also, if you liked hearing me discuss horror films, make sure to check out my podcast, Scared Speechless, where every episode I discuss with my good friend Aaron a different horror film. It's a lot of fun, and we discuss a lot of different types of horror movies. I'll leave a link in the description down below so you guys can check that out. And as always, I will see you guys on the next video.